All right, we are on page 452 in the Shulchan Aruch, which if you're joining us and you don't have a book, you want to go to Sefaria, Shulchan Aruch, Orach Chaim, chapter 168. Kuf Samechet, 168. We're in Seif Yod, 10. We're going to deal with a whole new concept in the laws of Hamotzi. And by the way, we're coming very close to the end of the book, in which we're going to want to talk about what we study afterwards. We have less than 40 pages left till we're done this volume. We've been doing this together since 2017. This concept Maran is going to introduce to us in Seif Yud is found originally in Masechet Berachot on page Lamed Zayin Amud Bet, page 37b. Is the sugya, and if you want between tonight and tomorrow to look into the sugya yourself, it might actually help. Surrounding this food called a chavitza. Chavitza. Have you heard this word before? I'm sure some of you. Doan, you finished Masechet Berachot already a long time ago. Chavitza is an argument among our rabbis. What exactly is this food? So Maran is going to write what Maran writes, and we'll take it from there. Tomorrow night we'll do an extensive footnote with much of the background conversation. What really is a chavitza, what is not a chavitza, how this works. But for now, let's just read Maran the way Maran wrote it. Chavitza, Dehainu, that means pirwei lechem, breadcrumbs, shenidbakim yachad alidei marak, that have been stuck together through some kind of liquid. Soup, marak is a soup, but any kind of liquid. So let's pause for a moment. When Maran says pirwei lechem, breadcrumbs, what does Maran mean? What are breadcrumbs? I'm going to ask you some fancy halakha here.
They're like the pieces of bread, like that falls apart.
Very good. Bread that is crumbled into breadcrumbs. Now, Baruch, the breadcrumbs you're talking about are like what's left over in your Shabbat table. Here, it's you took your leftover challah from Shabbat and you dried it out and then crumbled it up into breadcrumbs. Yeah, those are breadcrumbs.
Or croutons. You put it in soup.
Okay, croutons are also good. Croutons, well, you're going to see actually, because Maran is going to talk about the size of these breadcrumbs in just a moment. That's a very good point. When you go to the store and you buy breadcrumbs, I'm not certain that those are actually breadcrumbs. I mean, they may be the equivalent of what happens when you take bread and crumble it, but if a machine is making breadcrumbs, and I don't actually know the breadcrumbs that are sold commercially, if all of them are made that way, or if they started as bread and then manufactured into breadcrumbs. You know, in the world of food, there's some pretty clever things that are done in order to reduce, I wouldn't say reduce food waste, because the amount of food that is wasted in this country on a daily basis is horrifying. It's not terrible, it's horrifying. You think about people who can't afford food, and then you hear about crops being destroyed intentionally, you hear about animals being destroyed intentionally. You look behind grocery stores and restaurants and the amount of food that is thrown away every single day. I'm not talking about that kind of food waste. I'm talking about people invested money in a product. I'll give you an example. Many of you may have seen granola bars. You know what a granola bar? So there's this, what is the name of the green granola bars? The Nature's Valley granola bars. Nature's Valley granola bars are the green double packages of granola bars. When you make a granola bar, they don't all come out perfect. And the machines get covered in granola pieces and everything else. At the end of the run, there's some granola bars that are broken or whatever. What do you do with all that stuff? You just throw it away? You don't throw it away. Why would you waste good granola bars? When I was working in, behind the scenes in Hashgacha, you would often see that you have these huge sacks of granola cereal. And you look at who manufactures them, it's the Nature's Valley brand. It's like all the pieces that were left over from that run are turned into a granola cereal. You have similar things in other companies. The leftover things are made into something else. So it could be that some bread-making companies take their dried bread or their less successful bread and make it into breadcrumbs. But if I had to believe it, I would say that most likely the companies that make their living from making breadcrumbs, they are not baking really nice loaves of bread and then crumbling them for you. They actually have a way to make breadcrumbs themselves. But we're talking here about homemade breadcrumbs. So you have challah from Shabbat, and after Shabbat is over, your bread dried out, because why would your bread have any preservatives in it? And that bread is already, sometimes I buy bread from our Arab cousins, and I come home with these flat breads, and you make hamotzi on them, and then by the time dessert rolls around, they're already crunchy. You can't eat them anymore like bread. So that you made breadcrumbs out of that. So what's the din? Imnit bashel. You now cook those breadcrumbs together. Im yesh behem kezait. If there is an olive's amount in this cooked breadcrumb piece, if there's an olive size there, afal pi she'en ba to'ar lechem, even though it doesn't have, and you have to remember this term, to'ar lechem, it's going to have a different wording in Aramaic, but in Hebrew you might also see this called tzurat hapat. It doesn't have the likeliness of bread, meaning it's not evident that this is bread. It could be something else. So imagine zev soup croutons or salad croutons. You could see a big chunk of bread, and you see sometimes even a crust on one side of the bread. Yeah? So that's something shenikar bo to'ar lechem. It's obvious. But you look, let's say, at a matzah ball, for example. A matzah ball, someone could tell you they made that out of oatmeal, or they made it out of, it's something mushed together. I don't know what it is. I mean, I know what it is, but not from looking at it. It doesn't have tzurat hapat. So if it's something that is larger than the size of an olive, or at least the size of an olive, even though it doesn't have to'ar lechem, it's not recognizably bread. Mevarech hamotzi u'berkat hamazon. You must recite hamotzi and berkat hamazon on this cooked breadcrumb food. Vim en behem kezait. And if there is less than the size of an olive, afal pi shenira sheyesh bo to'ar lechem, even though you could recognize that this is from bread, eno mevarech el haboreh minei mezonot uvracha echat me'en shalosh. You only recite borei minei mezonot and the after blessing of al michya. It's important to remember that we think bread is bread. What is bread? What makes bread bread? Flour, water. What makes it bread? But when going through all the halachot until now, pataba b'kisanin, you're talking about other things, that the sweet breads, the stuffed breads, you realize that there's more that goes into the halachic definition of lechem, hamotzi lechem min haaretz, than just flour and water and you eat it. Rather, there has to be the shape of bread. It has to be eaten like bread, so not just how much of it you eat, but why are you eating it? Remember the things that you were eating before, just like a snack. Until you ate a certain amount, it doesn't become a hamotzi. Why? It's bread. If it's bread in 5 bites, why is it not bread in 1 bite? Because part of what makes bread bread is its tzura, is its shape. And here you see that bread that has the right resemblance, but not enough of it, is now mezonot and men shalosh. Vim eno mevushal, and if it's not cooked, ela shu mechubar al yedei dvash o marak. So this is now uncooked breadcrumbs that are connected together through honey or some kind of other liquid. So imagine, forgive me for the reference, but imagine Rice Krispie treats that are stuck together with peanut butter or marshmallows or something like that. It's something that binds together, but it's not cooked. Yes? So Rice Krispie treats are not a good example because those are not a hamotzi anyways. But I'm talking about something that is a hamotzi that's bound together, not through cooking. Im yesh bepursot kezait, if in each slice there is the amount of an olive, mevarech alav hamotzi, you recite hamotzi. Afilu en lo to'ar lechem, even if it does not have an image of bread. Ve'im en behem kezait, and if there's not an olive's amount in there, im yesh behem to'ar lechem, if they have resemblance of bread, or I need to think of a good word for that. If it's recognizable that it's from bread. Dahainu shu nikar v'yadua shu lechem, that it's obvious to a person who sees it that this is bread. Mevarech alav hamotzi u'berkat hamazon. You recite hamotzi and berkat hamazon. So how is this different than the case before? Before, it was cooked. Less than a kezait if it was cooked. Even though you could tell that it came from bread, you recited on it borei min mezonot. Here it's not cooked. It's crumbled. It's bound together. It's less than a kezait, but you can recognize that it's from bread, so it maintains its hamotzi status and its birkat hamazon status. So really, it seems to be that previously the cooking is what affects the bracha status. V'im en behem toar lechem, and if they don't have a toar lechem, mevarech borei min mezonot uvracha achad men shalosh. So if it's less than a kezait, and it does not resemble bread, so then that now becomes a borei min mezonot and a bracha men shalosh. Now, what about breadcrumbs that are bound together? They're not bound together. They're not cooked together. They're just breadcrumbs. So we mentioned, let's say you're sitting at your Shabbat table. It's after Birkat Hamazon. You see a few breadcrumbs on the table. You want to pick them up with your fingers and eat them. There's a sesame seed attached to it or something. What bracha is that? V'im eno lo mevushal v'lo mechubar. If it's not cooked, it's not bound together. Ela mefurar. Some Shulchan Aruch will say mefurad, which means separated, but mefurar seems to be more correct. It's crumbled. Dak. Very, very, it's separated very thin. It's little small pieces. Even though it does not have a kezait and not a resemblance to bread, you still recite hamotzi and birkat hamazon on it. So the bracha on breadcrumbs is hamotzi and birkat hamazon. Yes, Rabbi Yosef.
Why would you be saying Birkat Hamazon though if you didn't have a kazayit with it?
Very good. Here he doesn't mention. That's a very good question. Afapish en bo kazayit. Mitzvah we read last week, which was that if it's less than a kazayit, then it wouldn't warrant a Birkat Hamazon. Let me just look for one moment. It's a good question.
Does he mean that each piece is not a kazait, or the entire volume of what you ate was not a kazait?
Very good. I think that's the answer to the question. I think he's meaning, right now he's not telling you how much you have to eat in order to be obligated in hamotzi. Rather, it's the sizes, very good. The sizes of the piece. That was Pam? Who was that? Yeah?
Yeah, that was me.
Okay, the sizes of the piece are what dictate whether or not it's a hamotzi, and we're saying it's less than a kazayit in size, meaning however much you have is going to help you with your after bracha. But right now, it's a question of what is its status. Because they're so small, you might think maybe they're not hamotzi, but no, they are hamotzi, even though they're less than a kazayit right now. And we're going to talk about that also.
If you order a bowl of soup, let's say French onion soup in a restaurant, and it has croutons in it, so you would make hamotzi over the soup and wash your hands first?
Okay, so we didn't, Zev, you're jumping way ahead because we didn't even lay down the groundwork. I know you do. That we rely on it, Zev. That is.
When in the world are you going to a restaurant and eating croutons and MSG onion soup?
Not MSG, but I can dream, can't I?
in those random times where Zev gets to New York. So you have those croutons. That's the question. The question really we're going to get to is, in general, if I make croutons out of bread, what is their bracha? But you're asking Zev even a more complicated question, because that's not really just a question on what happens if I make croutons out of bread. That's a question if the commercial breadcrumbs that are being sold or served in restaurants, if those are actually hamotzi in the first place. They might not even be bread at all. They might just be made into breadcrumbs, which may very well change their bracha status. We'll have to explore that. That whole conversation about breadcrumbs is going to be on page 461, 462. We're going to deal with that. And then we're also going to deal with, an obvious example, like I said last week, of the breadcrumbs that are cooked together in a soup would be a matzah ball. That's probably the most classic example of that. You took something that was matzah, you ground it up, and now you made it into So, by the way, I don't know. Rabbanit, maybe you could help me out here. I know that gefilte fish, is actually made up of. They don't use wheat flour for most of them. They use matzah meal. Any discussion ever, Rabbanit, in the Ashkenazi community of what happens when you're snacking on gefilte fish on Tuesday afternoon and you want to know which bracha to make on it? Is my wife there?
That's a very good question. The mitzvah is to eat all the gefilte fish Friday night and Shabbat morning. So you normally don't eat it without challah and chrein and a lot of other potato salad with a lot of mayonnaise. So it's normally covered by amotzi.
Oh my gosh.
That sounded like a heart attack waiting to happen right away. But you
It's all right. Eat it during the week.
I once had a rabbi who studied in Porat Yosef, and I don't know if you know much about it. Porat Yosef was a very poor yeshiva back in the day, and they have, when you go to many places, especially in Jewish places, I don't know why, they have these towels that go on, like outside of the public sink, they have these towels that are on rollers. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
So you like dry your hands and then push it or pull it, and then the next guy gets whatever you dry your hands with. And the towel always smells. You never wonder how they get it off that chain. And it's
Or it's wet.
it's wet, right? Exactly. So this rabbi once told me that when he was in Porat Yosef, they used to joke that on the meatballs, there was so much flour inside of them and no meat at all that they would make hamotzi on the meatballs. And they would say al netilat yadayim, not when they washed their hands, but when they dried their hands in the towel because the towel was so full of water. They would say al netilat yadayim on the towel and hamotzi on the meatballs. That's a good question. Okay, we're going to get into all the details of what happens when you cook breadcrumbs and the like. B'ezrat Hashem.
I have just one question.
Please.
Well, why are you doing the good part of Mazan if you're eating little breadcrumbs? Don't you have to be satisfied by what you're eating?
That is a fantastic question. So let me ask you, how much do you have to eat to be obligated in Birkat Hamazon?
To be satisfied.
Is that what you have to eat?
Be satisfied.
Okay,
In the Torah it says, V'achalta v'savata u'v'rachta, that you must eat, be satisfied, and bless HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's to be biblically obligated in a Birkat Hamazon. But our rabbis obligated us in Birkat Hamazon already when we eat the size of an egg, kibitzah. So once we eat the size of an egg, we're not satisfied, and we're saying Birkat Hamazon. There's an interesting Gemara which mentions that it's a very unusual piece of Talmud. It's an Agadata, which requires limud like an Agadata. You can't just quote it in a halachic context. But the Gemara says that the angels once complained to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It says in Birkat Kohanim, Yivarechecha Adonai v'yishmerecha. Ye'er Adonai panav elecha v'choneka. Yisa Adonai panav elecha v'yasem lecha shalom. What does it mean, Yisa Adonai panav elecha? What does the word Yisa mean?
To elevate.
Favoritism.
It shows favoritism. Say the angels, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, aren't you commanded, lo yisa panim, not to show favoritism? How do you say, I show favoritism to Am Yisrael? You're not supposed to show favoritism. And there's a unique piece of Talmud there which says, really you're right. But my children, I commanded them to say Birkat Hamazon when they're satisfied after eating a meal. But they say Birkat Hamazon even when they're not satisfied. Just when they eat the size of an olive or an egg. And that's the reason why and the angels were quiet after that. Which I think just breeds 1,000 more questions. Of all the things you could think about what Am Yisrael do, that's what makes us have favoritism. It's an interesting question. Maybe I'll look into that Agadah over the coming week and we'll see if it's relevant to bring it up in next week's Shiurim. B'ezrat Hashem. Cheved, let's anyone have any more questions before we do Arvit and then Selichot? B'ezrat Hashem.
I just wanted to ask real quick.
Please.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Okay. I wanted to ask real quick. So bread pudding, when you have challah that's left over and you crumble it up, that falls in with that as well?
You guys call that something. What do you call that?
The special challah kugel you make.
Challah kugel. So, there's a lot of conversation among the Ashkenazi rabbis. Which bracha do you recite on challah kugel? I think we're going to start. I mean, I don't know if, I'll be honest, the Sephardic books, I don't know if they can get to all those details, but there's a very good article I saw recently about bread pudding and the blessing that we recite on bread pudding. Let's do this chapter, and I'll bring it up in this chapter. We'll deal with the details of that. B'ezrat Hashem.
It's funny, we had the same question.
About bread pudding?
Safta, just keep eating quinoa until we have the answer.
Yes. You too.
So me, only vegetables.
All right, Rabotai.